He rode with Billy the Kid, stared down lawmen without flinching, and carved his name into the bloodstained legends of the Old West. José Chávez y Chávez wasn't just another outlaw. He was a ruthless survivor, a cold-blooded gunslinger with a cause, and one of the most dangerous men to ever ride through New Mexico territory. Feared by enemies and respected by fellow bandits, his story is a fiery mix of rebellion, violence, and loyalty. Yet his name remains strangely overlooked in the dusty pages of history. Stick around as we dive into the life of this deadly desperado and uncover why Chávez y Chávez may have been the deadliest member of Billy the Kid's gang. Like stories of real-life legends from the Old West? Hit that subscribe button and saddle up. There's a whole frontier of outlaw tales waiting just for you. José Kobe Frey, Chávez y Chávez was a Mexican-American figure from the era of the American frontier, born in the region then known as the New Mexico Territory, what is now the modern state of New Mexico. His life unfolded during a time of shifting borders, rising tensions, and cultural transformation in the American Southwest. Chávez came from a unique and complex heritage. His father is believed to have been of Spanish descent, while his mother was reportedly Apache. This blending of cultures placed him at the intersection of two very different worlds, indigenous and European, which likely influenced both how he saw himself and how others in society viewed him. In many ways, Chávez's identity reflected the broader cultural tapestry of the American Southwest during the late 19th century, where traditions, languages, and loyalties often blended and clashed. At a young age, Chávez became involved with a group known as the Lincoln County Regulators, a loosely organized faction originally formed to stand up against local corruption and lawlessness in Lincoln County, New Mexico. The Regulators played a key role in the infamous Lincoln County War, a conflict fueled not just by personal grudges, but by economic rivalries, political power struggles, and competing visions of justice on the frontier. While some accounts label him as an outlaw, Chávez's involvement with the Regulators suggests a more complicated story, one rooted not only in rebellion, but perhaps in a search for fairness during a time when official justice was unevenly applied. His early choices may have been shaped more by circumstance than by criminal intent, particularly in a region where loyalties were fluid and the definition of right and wrong was often blurred. In the years that followed, Chávez would be remembered less as a common criminal and more as a man who walked the edge between resistance and survival. One of many in the Old West whose story reveals the deep social divides and cultural conflicts of the time. Early life. José Chávez y Chávez was born in 1851 in the small settlement of Cebolleta, located in what was then the New Mexico Territory. At the time, this region was undergoing dramatic changes, having only recently transitioned from Mexican to American governance following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. This shift created uncertainty for many Mexican-American families, especially in rural communities like Cebolleta, where economic opportunities were limited and social structures were in flux. Very little documentation exists regarding Chávez's early life. As with many frontier families, written records were scarce, and oral histories often faded with time. What can be inferred, however, is that he grew up during a period of deep cultural adjustment and regional instability. These factors likely played a role in shaping his worldview and future choices. As a young man, Chávez took up work as a laborer, engaging in manual tasks that were both physically demanding and poorly paid. For individuals of mixed ancestry and limited means, steady employment could be hard to find, and even harder to keep. The promise of upward mobility often proved elusive in the rugged environment of the New Mexico Territory. Over time, as consistent work remained out of reach, Chávez found himself pulled toward less conventional ways of making a living. He reportedly became involved in minor acts of theft, often seen at the time as survival strategies in a harsh and competitive frontier economy. Eventually, this path led him into cattle rustling, a practice that was surprisingly widespread during the 19th century. In the American West, cattle rustling occupied a morally gray area. While technically illegal, it was sometimes viewed as a response to unequal land ownership and economic hardship, particularly among Hispanic and indigenous communities who were marginalized by expanding Anglo-American settlement. For men like Chavez, it was less about rebellion and more about adapting to a system that left few options for those on the fringes of society. Rather than painting him solely as a criminal, it's more accurate to view Chavez's early years as reflective of the larger social and economic struggles facing many in the Southwest during the post-Mexican War era. His journey from day laborer to frontier renegade was not unique. It mirrored the experiences of countless others caught between two cultures and searching for a place in a rapidly changing land. Lincoln County Wars. In his 20s, José Chávez y Chávez became actively involved in one of the most infamous conflicts of the American Old West, the Lincoln County War. Prior to this, he had already gained experience navigating the rough terrain of frontier life, occasionally stepping outside the bounds of the law through small-scale theft and questionable dealings. These early actions, while considered criminal by the standards of the time, were not uncommon in a region where legal systems were inconsistent and often influenced by wealth and political favor. Drawn by a sense of allegiance, or perhaps necessity, Chavez aligned himself with the Tunstall-McSween faction, a group of ranchers and businessmen who were locked in an intense power struggle with a rival economic and political group led by James Dolan. This ongoing feud over commercial dominance in Lincoln County, New Mexico, erupted into a prolonged series of confrontations between 1878 and 1879. Within the Tunstall-McSween camp, a subgroup formed with the goal of defending the interests of their employers and seeking justice for perceived wrongs. This faction became known as the Lincoln County Regulators, and it soon grew into a semi-organized band of men, numbering approximately 45, who acted as informal enforcers during this turbulent period. Chavez was among their ranks, standing alongside individuals who would become legendary names in Old West history, including Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, Charlie Boger, Fred Waite, John Middleton, and Tom O'Folliard. Chavez's path crossed with these men during the most volatile phase of the conflict. His decision to ride with the Regulators appears to have been shaped by loyalty to the Tunstall-McSween cause, as well as personal bonds formed during this time. Notably, he developed close friendships with both Billy the Kid and Jim French, companions who shared his experiences on the rugged plains and in the politically charged atmosphere of Lincoln County. The conflict escalated rapidly following the death of English rancher John Tunstall on February 18, 1878, an event that many within the Tunstall-McSween camp viewed as a blatant act of injustice. This moment became a turning point, prompting the Regulators to take matters into their own hands. In the weeks that followed, tensions surged as the Regulators sought to confront those they believed responsible. One of these incidents included the killing of Sheriff William J. Brady, a known supporter of the Dolan faction. Chavez would later claim personal involvement in that act, suggesting that he saw himself not only as a participant, but as someone directly contributing to the Regulators' mission. The Lincoln County War reached its climax on July 19, 1878, during what would become known as the Five-Day Battle. Hostilities culminated in the siege and burning of Alexander McSween's home in Lincoln. 14 people, including McSween, his wife Susan, and several allied cowboys were inside the residence when it came under attack. The confrontation ended in chaos, with the structure engulfed in flames. 6 individuals perished, although all of Billy the Kid's associates, including Chavez, managed to escape the ordeal. While the Regulators had set out to pursue justice in a region rife with corruption and cronyism, their actions ultimately reflected the broader instability of the territory. In many ways, Chavez's involvement with the Regulators reveals a deeper truth about the Old West. It was a place where law and order were often defined by who held the most power, and survival frequently depended on which side of a feud one chose to stand. Rather than viewing Chavez simply as an outlaw, his role in the Lincoln County War speaks to the complexities of identity, loyalty, and frontier justice in 19th century New Mexico. He was not just a participant in a bloody conflict, but a man shaped by turbulent times, trying to navigate a world where morality was blurred and allegiances could mean everything. After the war. By March 1879, territorial leaders began to recognize the growing instability in New Mexico. Governor Lew Wallace, a Civil War veteran and author who had been appointed as governor of the territory, set out to restore order and reduce the rising lawlessness that plagued the region. One of his key priorities was to bring an end to the lingering hostilities between the Dolan faction and supporters of the late John Tunstall and Alexander McSween. In an attempt to re-establish a sense of structure, Wallace authorized the creation of a new unit called the Lincoln County Mounted Rifles. This organization was designed to act as a territorial peacekeeping force, and it drew recruits from various backgrounds, some with checkered pasts, others with hopes of redemption. Interestingly, José Chávez y Chávez joined the unit as a private. His inclusion reflected both his familiarity with the local dynamics and his potential usefulness in navigating Lincoln County's deeply entrenched rivalries. Despite its intended purpose, the mounted rifles faced internal weaknesses and external pressures that made success elusive. The group disbanded after just a few months, unable to quell the disorder or mend the divisions that had already grown too deep. During this brief period, Chávez continued to maintain ties with former associates, including Billy the Kid, whose presence in the region remained both legendary and controversial. There are accounts suggesting that Chávez, alongside Billy the Kid, later appeared in court to give testimony regarding the dramatic conclusion of the Lincoln County War. They reportedly tried to implicate members of the U.S. military in the events surrounding the burning of the McSween residence, a tragic episode that had resulted in several deaths. If true, this move suggests that Chávez was not only involved in frontier conflict, but also willing to challenge institutional power in pursuit of what he believed to be the truth. In the years following the end of the Lincoln County War, Chávez's life became more unsettled. The death of Billy the Kid in 1881 marked the end of an era, and for Chávez, it also signaled a personal turning point. With no clear direction, he spent time wandering through various parts of the American Southwest, an experience shared by many whose lives had been shaped by the uncertainty of frontier justice and shifting allegiances. By the early 1880s, Chávez made his way to Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was then a bustling and often unruly railroad town. According to local lore, it was here that he encountered Bob Ford, the man known for killing Jesse James. Though the details are hazy and likely embellished over time, one version of the story claims the two men agreed to participate in a shooting contest. It is said that Ford, startled by Chávez's skill, chose to withdraw rather than risk a challenge, highlighting the growing legend surrounding Chávez's abilities. Later, Chávez took on a more formal role in law enforcement and briefly served as a deputy sheriff. However, maintaining this new path proved difficult. Old habits and past associations resurfaced, and he eventually reconnected with figures involved in more shadowy pursuits. One such figure was Vicente Silva, a saloon owner and local leader who operated several clandestine groups in northern New Mexico. Chávez became affiliated with Silva's circles, including a vigilante organization known as Las Gorras Blancas, or the Whitecaps. While English-speaking settlers often described this group as lawless, many Hispanic residents viewed them as defenders of traditional land rights and cultural autonomy. Las Gorras Blancas sought to resist encroachment by railroad companies, speculators, and newcomers who disregarded the property claims of long-established Mexican-American communities. Silva also led another, more secretive organization often referred to as the Society of Bandits, which was rumored to have enforced its will through intimidation and underground influence. Anglo-American accounts sometimes likened the group to a frontier version of organized crime, while local supporters saw them as part of a broader resistance against economic and political marginalization. Chávez's involvement with both groups paints a complex portrait, one not just of a former outlaw, but of a man navigating a deeply divided society. By the early 1890s, José Chávez y Chávez found himself entangled in the increasingly unstable inner workings of Vicente Silva's secretive organization. Silva, who had risen to power as a saloon owner and underground figure in Las Vegas, New Mexico, began to issue orders that reflected growing paranoia and mistrust, even toward those within his close circle. On October 22, 1892, a troubling event unfolded when Patricio Maes, believed to have been a liability to the group's operations, was targeted. Reports suggest that Silva ordered Maes's removal from the equation, and the act was allegedly carried out by Chávez, along with two other associates, Eugenio Alarid and Julian Trujillo. At the time, these men were considered loyal enforcers within Silva's network, trusted to follow through on sensitive matters. The situation escalated further in early 1893, when Silva reportedly became suspicious of his own brother-in-law, Gabriel Sandoval. Fearing that Sandoval might possess knowledge of the Maes case and could potentially disclose it to authorities, Silva instructed the same group, Chávez, Alarid, and Trujillo, to neutralize this new perceived threat. However, Sandoval's sudden disappearance caused alarm within his family. His sister, who was also Silva's wife, grew increasingly concerned. This development appears to have pushed Silva further into isolation and desperation. Allegedly, he made the shocking decision to eliminate his wife, fearing she might draw unwanted attention to the group's actions. Silva once again turned to Chávez, Alarid, and Trujillo, asking them to carry out the task. But at this point, the three men reportedly began to question Silva's judgment and stability. His decisions no longer seemed strategic. They appeared reckless and driven by fear. According to later testimony and legend, while preparing a burial site for Silva's wife, the three men made a decision that would alter the course of their lives. They resolved to bring an end to Silva's erratic influence, believing he had become a liability to everyone involved. When Silva eventually arrived at the site, they turned on him and laid him to rest in the same grave. This episode effectively marked the collapse of Silva's underground network. The following year, in 1894, law enforcement began to piece together parts of the story. An individual arrested in connection with the Maes case revealed the names of Chávez, Alarid, and Trujillo in relation to Gabriel Sandoval's death. With this information in hand, authorities moved quickly. In April of that year, Alarid and Trujillo were apprehended, stood trial, and received life sentences in prison. Chávez, aware of the crackdown, went into hiding. A $500 reward was offered for his capture, a substantial sum at the time, reflecting the seriousness of the charges and the attention the case was drawing. His time as a fugitive came to an end on May 26, 1894, when he was arrested in Socorro, New Mexico. During his trial, Chávez was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that reflected both the gravity of the accusations and the climate of justice in the New Mexico territory during the late 19th century. However, the legal battle did not end there. His case was brought before the Territorial Supreme Court, which granted him a retrial. The outcome of the second trial mirrored the first, resulting once again in a death sentence. Public interest in the case grew rapidly. Newspapers covered the proceedings, and many New Mexicans followed the developments closely. Amid the growing attention and rising pressure from the public to show leniency, Territorial Governor Miguel Antonio Otero stepped in. Taking into account the media spotlight and public appeals, Governor Otero made the decision to commute Chávez's sentence to life imprisonment. On November 23, 1897, José Chávez y Chávez officially entered the New Mexico Territorial Penitentiary in Santa Fe as inmate number 1089. He would remain incarcerated there for many years, spending the rest of his adult life behind prison walls. By the time he reached the age of 57, he had lived through decades of social unrest, political upheaval, and dramatic transformation in the American Southwest. Later life. On January 11, 1909, José Chávez y Chávez was granted a full pardon by New Mexico Territorial Governor George Curry. At the time, Chávez was 57 years old and had served approximately 11 years of a life sentence. The pardon was not a random act of clemency. It was reportedly issued in recognition of Chávez's cooperation with prison officials during a period of unrest at the penitentiary. His willingness to assist the guards in maintaining order demonstrated a change in character, at least in the eyes of the authorities. Following his release, Chávez returned to Las Vegas, New Mexico, a place that had witnessed much of his storied life. No longer entangled in political schemes or frontier feuds, he settled into a quieter existence. Over the next 15 years, he lived modestly among longtime friends and community members who remembered both his troubled past and his complex legacy. Though his earlier years had been filled with controversy, Chavez seemed to embrace a more peaceful way of life during his final chapter. He remained largely out of the public eye, and there is little evidence to suggest he ever returned to his former ways. His later life serves as a rare example of an Old West figure who transitioned from infamy to relative obscurity, and perhaps even redemption, as the American frontier faded into memory. In 1924, at the age of 72, José Chávez y Chávez passed away quietly in his bed. He was not alone. At his side was Liberato Baca, a longtime companion and loyal friend. Local legend claims Baca was one of the few men who had ever stood opposite Chavez in an armed standoff and lived to tell the tale, though whether that account is fact or folklore remains uncertain. Regardless, the two shared a deep bond that lasted into Chavez's final moments. Chavez was laid to rest in a modest cemetery near Milagro in Guadalupe County, New Mexico, far from the battlegrounds of Lincoln County in the cells of the Santa Fe Penitentiary. His grave is a quiet monument to a man whose life mirrored the contradictions of the Old West. Lawman and outlaw, fighter and peacemaker, myth and man. In a land shaped by dust, legend, and shifting loyalties, José Chávez y Chávez carved out a story unlike any other. He rode with Billy the Kid, outlived the Lincoln County War, vanished into the shadows of secret societies, and somehow emerged decades later as a man seeking peace. His life was never simple, never clean, but it was unforgettable. Neither fully hero nor outright villain, Chavez was a product of his time, complex, conflicted, and endlessly fascinating. Enjoy tales like this one? Then saddle up and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more true legends, lost outlaws, and untamed history of the American frontier waiting just around the bend.